Welcome to Windows on the World. It's the right time and the right place, and we've got a great show for you tonight. We're going to be speaking to Sandy Adams a bit later on for a catch-up on what's been happening in and around the country this week, because we've been covering a lot of things over the last few weeks that all tie together, and if you go back into our archive you'll find that all of it ties together into a thing called the bigger picture. And the bigger picture is the name of a series of talks which we take around the country, and you can book them through the website. Go to windowsontheworld.net and have a look at what that's all about if you haven't already, because it's a lot of fun. You get to meet people and find out what's actually going on in different parts of the country. And interestingly, we see the rise of what we call populism, which is basically a political approach that strives to appeal to ordinary people who feel that their concerns are disregarded by established elite groups. And we've been seeing a lot of that in France. Obviously, there's controlling of the narrative going on all over the place. Tonight we're going to talk, though, about the bigger picture of education and indoctrination, basically how propaganda really works and how propaganda is brought into the classroom at a very early age. So let's have a look at a great word that we've been using over the past few weeks: uniformitarianism, the belief in a linear timeline and linear progression of everything, basically. So the belief in evolution and the fact that people still believe it. They still believe in this theory of evolution and Darwinian kind of evolution theory and social Darwinism. A lot of this is around what's being taught in schools and what's been going on for generations. We're going to get into all that. But let's first of all go to the recent uprising in France and the so-called rise of populism. It means a stringent controlling of the narrative is the only tool to attempt the control of public opinion, using the usual cliches, and this is what we talked about last week, attaching an ideology or Pavlovian conditioned response term to those who are usurping the narrative of allowed public opinion through limited propaganda, and defining what is inclusive and diverse and what is and is not hate speak. So hate speak is basically the shutting down of everything through political correctness, and it's a very interesting time because vocabulary is at its most restricted ever. I don't think there's been a time where vocabulary has been this restricted. So we're going to be talking about that tonight. I'll just see who's in chat. Oh, we've got plenty of people in there, so good evening everybody. So populism, yes, that's a good thing to talk about and a good place to start this. So I'm just going to open up with something from zerohedge.com, and it was about a firm that warned Americans Russian bots was running army fake Russian bots. So basically this firm had warned about Americans. Americans were being invaded by these Russian bots everywhere. We're actually creating them. It says here, like that scene in Orwell's 1984 where the party switches official enemies right in the middle of the Hate Week rally. The war on terror was officially cancelled and replaced by the war on populism. Isn't this just the truth? It's exactly what we're talking about. Now, this came out of this article, but I thought this particular paragraph was really powerful. We're going to get into some of these propaganda industrial kind of operations a bit later on in the show, but I just thought this was a really good quote to kick off what we're going to be doing. So basically, this sort of war on terror was officially cancelled and replaced by the war on populism. Now this is really interesting because of course MI5, Mark Rowley, just before he resigned, head of MI5, stated that the rise of the far right was going to be this new problem, and of course that's what's been created and put into the media by all of its operatives. We're going to be talking about that as well. So it wasn't quite that abrupt, it says here, but seriously, go back and scan the news. Note how the Islamic terrorist threat we had been conditioned to live in fear of on a daily basis in 2001 seemed to just vanish into thin air. Suddenly the existential threat we were facing was neo-nationalism, illiberalism, or the pejorative design to de jure populism. The President of the United States is apparently both a Russian intelligence operative and literally the resurrection of Hitler. NBC and MSNBC have been officially merged with the CIA. The Guardian has dispensed with any pretense of journalism and is just making stories up. Well, also, they've just basically become like a lobbying point for different organisations. So you might as well just call that the propaganda rag of the 1984 narrative, really, with the stuff that comes out the propaganda in the Guardian. I mean, it's just incredible, the stuff that they write. And well, often they don't write it, it's just put in there and accepted. But yeah, we're going to talk about this bigger picture of how we've got all these useful idiots who seem to be controlling the narrative, and how we are put into a position of absolute serfdom within it all. So, education as indoctrination. Covering the origins of the new totalitarianism has been of utmost priority in our shows. It has been since we started. Now, this is very important for the present system, which is now going into the direction of real-time smart surveillance and data monitoring in real time to collect, classify and record sort of every information transaction. Now, this is a quote here I'm just going to describe, which actually preempts all this stuff, and we've covered Bertrand Russell in our shows on social engineering, but this is a very important place to start. Now, Bertrand Russell was born on the 8th of May 1872, died 2nd of February 1970. And one of the quotes that we're going to be using from Bertrand Russell was, "Education should aim at destroying free will." In the book The Impact of Science on Society, which was published in 1951, the following quotes are found. "Education should aim at destroying free will, so that after pupils have left school, they shall be incapable throughout the rest of their lives of thinking or acting otherwise than as their schoolmasters would have wished." And that's on page 50 of The Intended Result of Education. Now, this stuff goes back further than Bertrand Russell, and we're going to find out a little bit more about how it started at the turn of the century and before. Late 1800s onwards saw a huge change into this type of education. Let's have this quote from Bertrand Russell on the intended result of education. After all, most civilised and semi-civilised countries known to history and had a large class of slaves or serfs completely subordinate to their owners. Now, what you have to remember here is Bertrand Russell actually considered himself to be elite, and the elite are treated slightly differently than the serf class. We've talked about this over and over and over again. It's just a pyramid structure. So basically you've got a small elite at the top, an administrative class which administers for the elite and keeps the public narrative of controlled opinion in place, and then you've got all the people who haven't got a clue underneath that. But let's carry on with this quote. "There is nothing in human nature that makes the persistence of such a system impossible, and the whole development of scientific technique has made it easier than it used to be to maintain a despotic rule of a minority. When the government controls the distribution of food, its power is absolute, so long as they count on the police and the armed forces, and their loyalty can be secured by giving them some of the privileges of the governing class. I do not see how any internal movement or of revolt can ever bring freedom to the oppressed in a modern scientific dictatorship." And that's from page 54 of Scientific Dictatorship. Let's carry on with these quotes. "There are three ways of securing a society that shall be as stable as regards population. The first is that birth control is very important. The second, that of infanticide or really destructive wars. And the third, that general misery except for a powerful minority." So you basically introduce general misery except for a powerful minority. And he goes on with bacteriological war, population and world government. However, he says in conclusion, "My conclusion is that a scientific society can be stable given certain conditions. The first of these is a single government of the whole world, possessing a monopoly of armed force and therefore able to enforce peace. The second condition is a general diffusion of prosperity, so that there is no occasion for envy of one part of the world by another. The third condition, which supposes the second which is fulfilled, is a low birth rate everywhere, so that the population of the world becomes stationary or nearly so. The fourth condition is the provision of individual initiative, both in work and in play, and the greatest diffusion of power compatible with maintaining the necessary political and economic framework. Now, one thing I find that a lot of these intellectuals have in common is they're absolutely terrible writers. And I've found this since I've been looking into a lot of the stuff on social engineering. It doesn't really trip off the tongue. In fact, they're not as articulate as they think they are, these people. And we're going to get into that and as to why that is, and as to maybe why it's not important in the ruling classes for them to be able to actually articulate in that particular way, as long as they can articulate off the cuff and sound as though they know what they're talking about. And that is a major thing which the general population are not taught to do, to actually articulate themselves in any way when they're in a position of public speaking, to actually be able to work with logic, grammar and rhetoric. So that's just a side issue there. But next I wanted to get on to Johann Gottlieb Fichte, who was born in 1762. He died in 1814. He was a philosopher and an influence on the education system. Now, this is a quote that I think is really important, and it's a quote that I've never put out on any shows before, and it will really tie in to the information we've got here. Quote, "If the system is successful, its fruit will be as follows. Its pupil goes forth at the proper time as a fixed and unchangeable machine. In other words, you have to instill into people this stability, this uniformitarianism, and this linear view of how they are going to progress. And there is an assumption that learning will cease once education has finished." Well, in actual fact, the indoctrination as education program is the opposite, because education can only begin when you leave these establishments, unless of course you are chosen to be part of this elite structure. And the elite structure often are just merely tools of other influences, which is again the pyramid structure that we talk about. A lot of these people who are so-called elite or think they are elite are just another level or tier of administration. So this statement has now almost reached its logical conclusion. If the system is successful, and it seems to have been, its fruit will be as follows. Its pupil goes forth at the proper time as a fixed and unchangeable machine. It carries on here. This again is Johann Gottlieb Fichte. A huge influence on the education system. And of course, he was very much a philosophical figure of the time. So his influence actually became a lot greater after he died. Now, it carries on. The pupil of this education is not merely a member of human society here on this earth and for the short span of life which is permitted to him. He is also, and is undoubtedly, acknowledged by education to be a link in the eternal chain of spiritual life in a higher social order. Now, this has been broadly integrated into the New Age and these Agenda 21 principles, and away from religion into the sort of neo-pagan Gaia control system, which has reduced the meaning of life on earth to sort of units of physical energy, which in the end sort of go back into a conscious whole or a humanistic material belief. And again, you can see the influence of that from the 1960s onwards especially. So we're talking about here how all this stuff has progressed. It carries on. A training which has undertaken to include the whole of his being should undoubtedly lead him to a knowledge of his higher order also. Despite being seen as soft on religion by the Lutheran orthodoxy, Fichte argued that education must also be intensely religious. Now, this has obviously been changed into these new principles. It carries on. Under proper guidance, the student will find at the end that nothing really exists but life. the spiritual life which lives in thought, and that everything else does not really exist but only appears to exist. Now, this again is getting into weird areas of philosophy. Now, this is interesting that he says spiritual life exists in thought. Now, thoughts are not awareness, and awareness is the idea that this is the actual core centre of where you are. So the core centre of yourself is not thought. So that's a really interesting issue. Something that we've also talked about when we talk about consciousness in previous shows. Carries on. He will find that only in immediate contact with God and the direct emanation of his life from him will he find life, light and happiness. But in any separation from that immediate contact, death, darkness and misery. Education to true religion is therefore the final task of the new education. That was Johann Gottlieb Fichte, 1762 to 1814. Now, he was one of the major figures in German philosophy in the period between Kant and Hegel, initially considered one of Kant's most talented followers. Fichte also developed his own system of transcendental philosophy, the so-called Wissenschaftslehre. Okay, sorry, I wrote that down rather untidily. Wissenschaftslehre. Some of these ideas are quite worthy sounding, but the gist of Fichte's first statement here, the one we've just been repeating, if the system is successful, its fruit will be as follows: its pupil goes forth at the proper time as a fixed and unchangeable machine. Now, this is really interesting because when I was educated at school, I realised very soon after I'd left that I hadn't actually learned anything of any use whatsoever apart from reading and writing, and the education started when I left school because I didn't have an elite education. I had to teach myself logic, grammar and rhetoric and how to actually argue. And when I started learning how to do that, then I started realising how the education structure is actually working. So in other words, that the lower class of serfs are not allowed the knowledge which could actually improve their ability to communicate. So that's a really important thing. And we see that in a lot of these controlled opposition groups, the ones we talk about, that are reduced to kind of sound bites and meaningless rubbish, all of course controlled by political correctness and the narrative of accepted public opinion. And all of this education system is the background to all this. So it's very important as to where we are now to go into this stuff. So the origins of social engineering go back at least to the 1700s. Bertrand Russell, 1872 to 1970, we've just talked about him, the British philosopher, mathematician and an adamant internationalist, of course, globalists. The Scientific Outlook was one of his books, and the impact of science on society, I think that's where some of these quotes are coming from. He states that scientific societies as yet are in their infancy. This was at the time. It may be worthwhile to spend a few moments in speculating as to possible future developments of those that are oligarchies. It is to be expected that advances in physiology and psychology will give governments much more control over individual mentality than they now have, even in totalitarian countries. Now, this is a really interesting point, because if you go to places which are believed to be dictatorships, you'll have a bit of a revelation in that you will feel much less monitored than you are in the United Kingdom at the present time. Interesting point that. Yes, the brave new world of 1984, the current totalitarian system, is getting more totalitarian. Of course it is. Everyone can see that. So Fichte laid it down that education should aim at destroying free will, which is the most important thing. Because destroying free will destroys creativity, and creativity is the enemy of the education and indoctrination system. It's the ability to actually see a wider picture, to be able to put together things that appear to be unconnected. And this is the problem that you'll have when you talk about connected things to the majority of people. They don't see how anything is connected because they've been through the education system. Carries on, so that after pupils have left school, they shall be incapable throughout the rest of their lives of thinking or acting otherwise than as their schoolmasters would have wished. Now, that wore off pretty quick with me, and probably with most of our listeners. There were one or two teachers at school that I can remember as being competent, but I can't remember any of them being any good. Now that sounds really condescending, but I think it's true, because when I left school I found some brilliant teachers because I wanted to specialise. I started looking at specialised areas, and I found what I would call, or maybe the old Hindu system would call, gurus, which means going from the dark into the light. Basically, a guru is someone who teaches you how to go into an area where you can actually put things together. And I've had a few of those, and I've met a few of those sort of people, and they were nothing like the learn by rote sort of teachers at school, because they used a method which is kind of holistic and also related into what they could, a bit like Zen Buddhism actually. In other words, that things are knocked into you through basically learning them yourself. So you have to go up against problems and then solve the problem yourself, rather than just by repetition. Quite interesting, all that. So it carries on here. Anyway, diet, injections and injunctions will combine from a very early age to produce the sort of character and the sort of beliefs that the authorities consider desirable, and any serious criticism of the powers that be will become psychologically impossible. Well, that clearly doesn't work with certain people. It seems to work with the majority, though. So this is how gatekeepers are created. The useful idiots of the future have to be properly trained from birth, along with the hive workers and administrators. So gradually, by selective breeding, it carries on, the congenital differences between the rulers and ruled will increase until they become almost different species. A revolt of the plebs would become as unthinkable as an organised insurrection of sheep against the practice of eating mutton. Now, this is clearly not the case, and it's clearly not the case with what's happened in France, even if you take that as one example, because that was a protest about fuel. And the latest thing is that 2/3 of the country's speed cameras have been destroyed, which means that that is free will. So in other words, free will is not unthinkable. So Bertrand Russell was wrong there. He's actually wrong. The idea that the elite can control in the way that they wish to will only work if people are thinking along the same lines as they're meant to. So clearly that doesn't always work, and it's going to work less and less as this so-called paradigm is broken down and this politically correct control narrative is taken apart for what it is, because going from government, education, doesn't matter if it's education, government, intelligence services, they're all using the same model. Once that model is busted, then it's all over. And the ad hominems and the attacks, the limited ideology will all then tend to cease, and it won't be effective anymore. It's a magic spell. That magic spell can be broken quite easily. That's something that I think is really important, because spells are just mantras that are repeated, and they're repeated with a belief that they are real and will come to pass, and they will become reality. So it can't work indefinitely. Now, here we go. This is education in a scientific society. In like manner, the scientific rulers will provide one kind of education for ordinary men and women, and another for those who are to become holders of scientific power. There's an interesting one. Let's have a look at this as it relates to the current paradigm. So something like climate change. So you've got the IPCC, and of course the fake belief that 97% of scientists agree when they don't, when it's about 0.3%, but the 0.3% are the people they're talking about here. So basically these are the holders of scientific power. Power is basically not about the knowledge, it's about where the knowledge is put. In other words, the value that it's given by the public, the value it's given through the media and through the education system to the public. There are the people who are rewarded through ego massage and large salaries and given the accolades which keep them in place and in high esteem with the public, and these are the ones we're talking about here. Ordinary men and women, it carries on, will be expected to be docile, industrial, punctual, thoughtless and contented. Well, this is an interesting one, isn't it? I think that you can also add to that now the distractions talked about by Aldous Huxley in Brave New World. In other words, that the distractions and the kind of painless concentration camp brought around by mindless kind of entertainment and social drugs and prescribed drugs is very important here. Now, there are definitely a lot of these docile industrial punctual, thoughtless and contented people. A lot of them are in very high positions. That's the weird thing about it, isn't it? So now there are definitely a lot of these, and the distractions to keep them from going anywhere near reality are well and truly in place. That's something that is very noticeable. Now it carries on, of these qualities probably contentment will be considered the most important. Isn't that just the truth? This self-satisfied, childlike kind of way that people are. In other words, they're absolutely happy with their own egos. They construct their own egos in such a manner that their egos will never be challenged, because they will not allow their egos to be challenged, because they've bought in to this narrow opinion corridor and the ability to only see things through repetition and political correctness. Really interesting, that one. Of these qualities, probably contentment will be considered the most important. Yeah, that's so true. In order to produce it, all the researches of psychoanalysis, behaviorism and biochemistry will be brought into play. Now, I bring up this quite a lot. It's really important to me, the actual way psychology is used and the psychological subversion and psychological controlling of narratives. I'm going to refer again to a book, Martin L. Gross, which came out in the 70s, The Psychological Society. And there's a quote here which I use in my talk as well, which is very interesting. The citizens of the psychological society are the most anxious, emotionally insecure and analysed population in the history of mankind. A new model of Westerner, dependent on others as to what is real or false. It is an art, science, therapy, religion, moral code, lifestyle, philosophy and cult. Its professional minions number in the hundreds of thousands. Well, it's hundreds of thousands of more since then, because a lot of the people we call change agents, all these people in local authority, the police, and basically positions within what is now known as community, which isn't, are these type of people. They are controlled psychologically, and they use psychology against the public. So psychology is an establishment approved cult. So basically that was from the Psychological Society, which what I would recommend anyone get hold of. It's described as a critical analysis of psychiatry, psychotherapy, psychoanalysis and the psychological revolution. So that's again very interesting there. So let's carry on with Bertrand Russell. Education in a scientific society. All the boys and girls will learn from an early age to be what is called cooperative, i.e. to do exactly what everybody is doing. Initiative will be discouraged in these children, and insubordination without being punished will be scientifically trained out of them. Now that is very important, and probably one of the most important statements so far, because this is absolute psychological control. So the foundations of the psychological and the new technocratic society go back to philosophers like Johann Fichte, who we've talked about in the last 15 minutes. So let's now look at principles of secondary education. Okay, this is a book that came out in 1918, and it's actually quite hard to get hold of, but I managed to get hold of a copy off the internet, and this describes how education was going to be pushed forward, what it meant and how it was going to be dished out basically within the education system. And it was written by Alexander Inglis, Assistant Professor of Education at Harvard University. It came out in 1918. Now this is under pupil, and it's about physical traits. Physical traits as basic data. All educational theory and practice must be determined primarily by the nature of the individuals to be educated. Reduced to its lowest terms, education is the process of producing, directing and preventing changes in human beings. I'll get that. So educational theory and practice is all about preventing changes in human beings. That's absolutely fascinating. Now, just apply that to your own education and ask yourself, Is that true? It's absolutely true. So yeah, all educational theory and practice must be determined primarily by the nature of the individuals to be educated. In other words, there has to be a system of selection. And the main aim is preventing changes in human beings. This is from this book from 1918, and it's written by Alexander Inglis, and it's called Principles of Secondary Education. Let's carry on with it. For the intelligent production, direction and prevention of such changes, a knowledge of the raw material with which education deals is a fundamental necessity, and hence the first problem of educational theory and practice in any department is concerned with the nature of those to be educated. Education before the age of 12 should emphasise memory and drill, repetition, and repetition basically. When they talk about memory, they're talking about this idea that memory is at its peak during the times of indoctrination or education, which is very interesting because memory can actually be accentuated by using certain techniques or just by using it. So that's an interesting thing. So they don't want you to remember too much after you're out of the education system. They just want you to repeat a certain amount of what you remember. In other words, it seems that in this system, reasoning is there merely for backing up the educational programming with an argument which supports what has been taught, rather than having any recourse to alternative information to challenge it. That's just something I've put in there, which I think is really important. So that reasoning is there merely for sort of backing up the educational programming with an argument which supports what has been taught. So in other words, your reasoning is not about getting an argument together which would contradict or prove something wrong, but it's about backing up what you've already been told. Now that's incredibly important, and one of the most important things that people do all the time, they back up what they believe through what they've been told. I find that one of the most important things, and to get that idea across I think is incredibly useful. Now this is how the public is steered and controlled through sort of every form of popular media available to them. It is important they are pushed into a hive mind of limited choices and outcomes, as anything outside this is very difficult to control, right? So that's exactly what these people are fighting against. So when the public are asked about how things work without gatekeepers and shepherds, they will generally respond with a statement, well, there would be anarchy. Now, how many times do you hear this? For one, they don't know what anarchy is, and for two, there wouldn't in the belief system that they're talking about. So what they're doing is they're just projecting what they've been told and repeating it without being able to actually challenge it. So that's a really interesting point. Without all of these imposed regulations, they would say there would be anarchy, which they now refer to as normality. So normality is basically anything that's outside free thought. So not understanding that anarchy would merely mean they were responsible enough to act on their own behalf and observe the natural law principles which have been educated out of them. So these natural law principles are really important, because once you start studying that and these basics of right and wrong, then you wouldn't get change agents. You wouldn't get people mentored into basically controlling the narrative of public opinion. You'd actually get them creating it and creating different debates within it. But obviously, these social engineers never wanted that. So I'm just going to have a look what's in chat. People are talking to each other, which is great. Monthly Blimpton, when I was at school, the man from the ministry gave us a talk at 13 to farm off all the likely workers for AWE Aldermaston. Yeah, now this is an interesting thing actually, because that's also something that does happen, this engineering and the controlling of who's going to be where, because the change agents are selected at a very early age. Of course, they're then mentored into the main indoctrination universities, Oxford and Cambridge, where they learn to think that they're really clever, and then they come out being subversives or politicians. Not all, of course, but this type of elite, so-called elite education, is just merely another form of programming. If you look at people who go through that sort of system, they're actually as programmed, but they have slightly more ability to express themselves, and also they can argue more because they've been given a bit more to argue with. However, whether it's useful or not is another thing, because it's only useful in certain situations, and that's where real education comes in. So let's now look at principles of secondary education. Again, this book, The Secondary School, 1918, Principles of Secondary Education. It carries on: develop gradually, continuously, and in a relative degree concomitantly. If not from birth, certainly from the beginning of education in the school until their maxima are approached. And further, that deterioration does not necessarily occur at an age much later than the limit of school lifetime. So this means that the model is to cease the limited learning very early on, so deterioration is not only socially engineered but a self-fulfilling property, so that people are taught to believe that they will deteriorate once this education and this type of learning has stopped, which is the opposite to ancient forms of education where you had real kind of elite type of thinking. So in other words, the guru, the master, the person who actually perfects their self as they get older is not included in this system, because you don't need them. You only need people who are adequate at what they are doing. You don't need them to excel. For instance, I had this brilliant teacher of singing who taught opera singing at the Royal Opera House, and he had been taught by Gilly, the opera singer. Now this is a very specialised thing, but what he did was an integrated approach which could not be taught in school. And this fellow was about 80, and he said to me, you'll need to be with me for 7 years and then I'll teach you everything I know. So I stuck with him for 7 years. He taught me everything he knew, and basically he taught me what was in fact a science. It wasn't just about really what the art of singing is, it was about the science behind it, and really how it ties in to every physical sensation that you have. And what it did was actually heightened certain senses to a degree where you would become much more aware. So this is another thing, that awareness, this heightened awareness of things, is just not actually taught. That's a really important point to me, that one. But my ability to think logically and critically didn't occur until years after I'd left school. And in fact, I learned nothing of importance in the 16 years of state education. And the only useful skill was reading and writing. Nothing else turned out to be of any importance whatsoever. Now, this again is from this book on secondary education by Alexander Inglis, came out in 1918. This is really interesting. Changes tending towards urbanisation. Remember, this was in 1918. One of the most important social changes noticeable which have taken place in this country within the past half century increased the tendency for the population to congregate in the cities and to withdraw from rural communities. Now, the new urban agenda that we see now has created non-communities and encourages more compliance and less original or logical thinking. Totally hive-minded groupthink, in fact. Now, there are less places for anything outside the control narratives, and all anti-propaganda is marginalised. Now, this has always been the aim of education and the preparation of the model citizen, which we're talking about here. Now, the book outlines the need for administrators and the narrow scope of knowledge within the system which is taught and available to individuals. The controlled information stream leads to societal controlled aspirations. This is so important. This is where you get the cult of what I call mediocrity. In other words, anything will do. Pick up any newspaper or even book or novel, and unless it's incredibly well written, it will be written with absolute mediocrity. And this is something I've noticed. This is something that's really, really increased over the past 15 to 20 years, along with the inability to actually articulate real argument. So all this is very part of it. The controlled information stream leads to the societal controlled aspirations and means that the sort of future wave slaves are only taught what's necessary to function at this very low level. So the higher education of so-called elite universities then creates a class who are also administrators and repeaters, but their elite status makes them believe that they are the ruling class and having an input into their reality, when in fact they are still at a very low level of information. And they're even more likely to repeat the restricted knowledge taught to them and defend it even more than the so-called less educated would do. Now, this is a really important point, because if you get people who know very little, they'll generally be more open to ideas that you have. The more so-called education and indoctrination people have, the more closed-minded they become. Now, isn't that a dichotomy? Because it should be the other way round. And this sort of holistic learning, for want of a better word, that I've experienced a couple of times goes really against all that. It's the total opposite to it. So this leads to incredulity from the more expensively brainwashed administrators to anything outside their learned belief system. This is what people are coming up all day long when they try and break this and actually get to some other kind of level, you know. So the rigid compartmentalization of knowledge is also useful because nothing is seen as a whole, just sort of unconnected pieces of a fractured reality. So the biggest fear of the so-called establishment or ruling order is that of being able to put things together in this way where everything links up. And that would be the biggest fear, which is why the education system has to work the way it does. So the rigid compartmentalization of knowledge is very useful because nothing is seen as a whole, just unconnected pieces of a fractured reality, and it becomes confusing. So basically through training and education, and to revert to straight back to what has been learned through repetition, it's the only form of reality. So this only form of reality is basically going back to repetition. So this is how countries are run, and governments selected, and there's just different levels of useful idiots in the administration. And this is the stuff we've covered so much in the social engineering side of things. Go back to that lecture by Dr. Richard Day at Mount Sinai in 1969 and look at it. It's called Social Engineers Then and Now. It was actually 2 shows based on this talk that was known as the New Barbarians. Basically what would happen, the scientific way to control people. So the learning of logic, grammar and rhetoric is only taught to those who will be able to shut down arguments from those sort of lower down the scale. Now here as we get into like the post-truth world, you know, the only way to argue facts is with facts, right? So the new form of fact for the citizen is repeating opinion, or basically how they feel about certain issues. Now this cult of feelings is incredible because basically feelings and opinions have overtaken facts, and once you do that, it means that this form of indoctrination is absolutely complete. You can't go anywhere after that, because once basically opinions are repeated as though they're facts, then you'd have no reality anymore whatsoever. So the standard response from administrators in local, say in central government and any other public service, is that when confronted with irrefutable fact, the response is that it's somehow about the way you feel about the issue. And the way around that, of course, is to actually quote law and get into an argument about lawful points of law, basically having a legal argument, putting it in a legal framework, because it actually breaks that down. And it's this incredible thing of, it's all about, well, I'm sorry you feel that way. No, I just gave you some facts. So don't say it's about the way I feel, because feelings have got nothing to do with it, you know. So like the post-truth world is the end of all fact and the new way of creating a fact-free world. So this is even beyond this system of indoctrination now. So basically creating a fact-free world without the administration having to know any facts, and this makes the propaganda much more simple and repetitive. And this is what we see in these sort of controlled opposition groups and all this stuff that we've been talking about recently, like this Extinction Rebellion, where people don't even know the founding document on which this kind of controlled globalist, anti-globalist movement is all about. So the people who are aligning themselves with things don't even know the fake reality which their own movement is based on. Quite incredible, that. But all this goes back to, basically I wasn't a good pupil at school, and I became one when I left school. And that was important because I had no respect for the education I was being given after a certain time. And apparently a lot of people actually do get into that kind of way of thinking, because the actual mentality that is existent in the education system when you're going through it is so dull and dreary that most people would want to get away from that. And of course the people who are going to be good administrators lap it all up. So general knowledge and the limited repetition of sort of controlled narratives is the model with sort of rote learning. So like general knowledge has very little use. This is another really important point, right? So general knowledge is very little use, and school doesn't prepare for specialised knowledge. That's the interesting thing. You then go to another 3 years of learning how to specialise, you know, and basically come out with a degree in something which is probably not going to be really very useful. So this is the thing I find, that this indoctrination gets worse as the person becomes more educated. Like, so basically, having met those who were considered sort of bright at school, I don't know if you've done this, but if you ever sort of meet these people who are at school with and they were considered bright and they passed all their exams, when you've actually gone through the whole system and done your own thing and come to these sort of conclusions, you realise how dim they actually are. And basically that paradigm of them not changing, so they were educated up to a certain point and stopped. So there seems to be no desire for knowledge after a certain point with a lot of these people who are put into this sort of administrative state education, the way that they do well in it. So now they would of course state that this was a conspiracy theory, you see, so they defend their own limitations, and that the education system prepared them for the perceived success that they've accepted and embraced. Again, going back to Aldous Huxley and Brave New World, you know, so that basically kind of corrals all of that sort of mentality. So the higher up in education you go, the more brainwashing and repetition there is. So academia is the refuge of the controlled narrative, and the whole purpose of academia is sort of to trap the upper level of administrators in a ghetto which is not accessible to the lower down administration. Again, the pyramid structure. So you've got this tiny elite at the top, the administrators in the middle, or priest class, basically the sons of Abel and the sons of Set, who were co-opted by the sons of Cain. That's another business model. That's the Freemasonic business model. So the sons of Set and the sons of Abel are used. The sons of Cain are the perceived elite class within a lot of these organisations. Just another business model, that's all it is. So basically these academics, you get this kind of thing with academics. They're often quite intelligent, but they're lost in this sea of impractical and compartmentalised knowledge. And I find this all the time with people who work in academia. In other words, they can never see the bigger picture. It seems to be beyond them. They don't seem to have been able to put this stuff together. I'm not generalising here in the respect that I'm covering everybody, but that is a general kind of symptom of people who've been in academia for a long time. In short, they're neutered sort of in every respect and can only function as part of a hierarchy created for the very purpose of sort of controlling narratives, basically defend your own mental slavery. So the education system has not done its job. The psychological society and the new technocratic feudalism will finish off anything outside the box, or will it, right? Which is getting to the point here. In recent times, great insight into the education system has been given by people like Charlotte Isabit, who was a teacher in the 1970s, and John Taylor Gatto, another teacher. Now, he was New York State Teacher of the Year, John Taylor Gatto. And this is one of his quotes. He says, "Schools are dangerous places for kids. They retard intellectual development, they retard moral development, they bankrupt communities financially by bleeding hundreds of millions of dollars into unproductive activity, and they bleed communities dynamically by taking the energies of children away from the general society and dissipating them." A great deal of this is about the dissipation of energy, wasting energy on unproductive activity, and schools are the number one place for that, in my opinion. He carries on, they're places of intimidation, bullying and sexual harassment, and even arson and murder. And the epidemic of national obesity can be traced, I think, to the training ground of the school cafeteria. It should not be compulsory, he says. His Teacher of the Year, John Taylor Gatto. Now, he was told there was no English lecture. Now, this lecture that I've just read out from this book by this guy, Alexander Inglis, the book was published in 1918. When he was at Harvard, Taylor Gatto was told that this English lecture, there was no records of, right? So let's go into it again and pull out some of the things that he found and that I found from this book. And it's from the secondary school, written in 1918. He was the assistant professor of education, was at Alexander Inglis at Harvard University. So bearing in mind his own university would not give Taylor Gatto access to one of its own lecturers and pupils. So, schools are to establish fixed habits of reaction to authority. This is one of the 6 principles of education. We're going to go into those now. The 6 principles of education. 1, the adjustive function. Schools are to establish fixed habits of reaction to authority. This is why the public will go along with sort of controlled opposition, because they're triggered to respond to a model of opposition which is instilled through their education. It's what the person knows. If they sort of have no reference to anything outside, then sort of the responses are limited and predictable. Now this saves enormous amounts of time, as they can be corralled into limited ideologies like the left-right system of parties, with the outliers sort of hoovered up into fake rebellion and groups like the Green Party, say, which are merely just globalist organisations again. So they create the fake left and the fake right. The truth is above it. The priest class know that, and the public always have to argue over 2 lies. One lie which is split into 2. That's actually the Soviet system, which is pretty near what we've got at the moment. So liberal Democrats or whatever other distraction groups are on offer sort of hoover up the sort of what they call the outliers, say like the People's Assembly, which is basically where you go to protest on behalf of the government. The People's Assembly is people protesting on behalf of their own enslavement. That's what it is. It's controlling the narrative. So you have to have, that's basically about absorbing every form of protest. So that's the first one, the adjustive function, the 6 principles of education we're talking about here. How schools are to establish fixed habits of reaction to authority, and otherwise control the narrative. That's the psychological term for it. Let's go on to point number 2 of the education system, the integrating function. Conformity. Now this means making all pupils conform to the limited and compartmentalised system, so making it impossible to think outside of it by the imposition of strict rules on intellectual development, right? That's incredibly important. There are strict rules imposed on intellectual development. So the world of, say, market research, PR and advertising needs a hive mind which can be exploited and controlled. Again, the Internet of Things, this is what it needs. The importance of uniformitarianism is more useful and keeps the herd contented and the aspirations limited. This also would include the elements of materialism and competitiveness to keep the distraction principle going. We're looking at social Darwinism here, and that's especially prevalent in the so-called elite universities of Oxford and Cambridge. Social Darwinism is taught to these people, and they're taught that they're special, which is a huge mistake. Anyone being taught that they're elite or they're special means that they are not going to really intellectually or psychologically or spiritually develop, and that's very important for the system too. So looking always at the smaller picture and restricting the accepted opinions and behaviour. The fear of ridicule must be instilled at an early age. That's incredibly important. So let's go to point number 3, the directive function. The defining of proper rules so that society functions in work, eat, sleep mode, and distractions are used at all times. So the idea that once education is complete, the pupil becomes a model worker and taxpayer, doesn't question it. People defend their slavery, they love paying taxes, they hate people who don't pay taxes because they have to. This is about the group hive mind think, getting them all to basically sort of work as citizen spies, you know. This is a big part of the communitarian big society. And I have great trouble with a lot of those people. Great fun calling them out on it as well. So the proper social role is defined, and defining where you are. That's very important, the directive function. Point number 4, the differentiating function, this is called. So basically diagnosed in layers, compartmentalisation, so that sort of rules are imposed on sections of society which define the people who've been selected for their own group. So you get put into your group. Yeah. So that's the thing about it, is that the differentiating function means that social groups don't tend to cross over. Very useful for the compartmentalisation. So there's no point in teaching hive workers anything above their station. As Henry Ford said, I want a nation of workers, not a nation of thinkers. He wasn't talking about everybody, but he was talking about what is needed in order for people to be content and productive within the system as it was then, which was about a lot more manufacturing than there is now. Now we just seem to have this kind of dumb administration system which everyone has to be a part of. Number 5, this is really important, the selective function. This is social Darwinism and labelling, encouraging shallow thinking so that boundaries are created and kept. This is where the control can be imposed by the controlled on each other. The belief instilled in the different groups which keeps them in those groups and not able to put together information in any way which can challenge the status quo. Again, very similar principle, but the selective function takes out those people who are needed for the training, the mentoring into the useful idiot program. So the propodetic function, now this is a Roman word. Now this is about training custodians, the future leaders, the useful idiots, obedient types who believe in social Darwinism, which their group was mentored into, the change agents, the so-called leaders, catapulted into public office and used by an elite structure to control the narrative, sort of hold up principles of the slave taxation system on the plantation where we all live. Now, this pontification of Darwinism, so we have to remember that the original title of the work, the actual origin of species, is On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection or the Preservation of Favoured Races in the Struggle for Life. In other words, there has to be a struggle for life. Well, in the 6th edition of 1872, the title was changed to The Origin of Species, so it took the eugenics element out of it for the public. In other words, they were just taught that evolution happens. So the ideas promoted, like survival of the fittest and the idea of competitiveness for the administrators, is relied upon by this system of education as it has become the sort of most important one in the past few hundred years. The fact that Darwin is given any credibility at all reflects the success of the indoctrination system of education. Go to the British Museum, the first thing you see is a statue of Charles Darwin and the childlike and stupid theory of evolution which has never been produced, and of course the missing link that's never been there. So the conclusion to this system is observable in the present, so the monitoring of everything and everyone for the purpose of not just of control but sort of data harvesting and precise social engineering. This is the natural progression of the education system described here. So the deliberate dumbing down means, as Aldous Huxley predicted, the gap between the elite educated few and the masses would increase over time. Now let's look what we've got. Now we seem to have a financial elite who are not actually intellectually elite but driven by the principles of the social Darwinism theory. Also, the materialistic model is a great control system within itself. So the only valuable commodity is information. So the fictional world of finance is another huge distraction. So the shows we do generally cover these sort of wider aspects of all this, the narrow opinion corridor and its gatekeepers. So we talk a lot about the NGOs, the think tanks, the mentoring of useful idiots who are given responsibility and act beyond their abilities. Now this is the promotion of the mentally impaired who become parasites in public office. So the sheer size of the programme is a huge mentoring programme from birth to death based on limited information for the sort of lazy brain shepherds to impose their totalitarian ideologies which have been rammed into them through simple repetition. So from the compliant taxpayer and defender of the small world of sort of restricted aspiration and belief to those who are controlling the narrative of public opinion. So basically, without information, there can be no informed debate and no informed decision making, which is absolutely where we are at the moment. I'm going to come back in 15 minutes with Sandy Adams to talk through some of this and go into some of the week's news. That hour went over really quickly, but there's a lot of information in there. I wanted to do an information-packed show because we're going to be picking up on a lot of these principles of education in future shows, and we've covered it in previous shows as far as social engineering goes, which is something we talk about a lot. So that's it from this part of the show. Thanks everyone in chat. We will be back in 15 minutes and the next show will appear on our timeline either on windowsontheworld.net or on one of our other platforms. We are available on YouTube, but we prefer people to listen to us on Spreaker, so do subscribe on Spreaker. and we're also on SoundCloud and various other places. But please use our Spreaker platform, and do get involved in chat on Sundays. See you all in a few minutes or in the next episode.